gunfire echoes in his mind every time it rains. Corporal Liam Hayes returned from deployment completely mute, his only lifeline a scarred Belgian Malinois guarding his hospital bed like a fortress. Nobody could break his silence. Then, a rookie trauma nurse read his classified file and whispered a single impossible word. Sunlight filtered weakly through the reinforced glass of room 412 at the Oak Ridge Veterans Rehabilitation Center in upstate New York, casting long, prison-like shadows across the linoleum floor. In the center of this sterile environment sat Corporal Liam Hayes. He was a statue carved from grief, his eyes fixed on a dead maple tree outside the window. Liam had not uttered a single syllable in 8 months. Beside his wheelchair, lying with rigid, hyper-vigilant posture, was Brutus. The Belgian Malinois possessed a coat the color of burnt sand and a torn left ear that served as a brutal testament to the IED blast that had ended Liam's military career and shattered his mind. Medical charts attached to the end of Liam's bed told a grim story. Severe post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, and profound psychogenic mutism. Top-tier psychiatrists, neurologists, and veteran advocates had all marched through the doors of room 412, armed with clinical strategies and false optimism. They had all retreated in defeat. Liam did not acknowledge their questions. He did not flinch when doors slammed. He existed in a permanent twilight, trapped somewhere in the dust of the Arghandab River Valley. The only proof that he was still alive was the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest, and the way his hand would unconsciously drift down to rest on Brutus's heavy head. Brutus was a problem for the hospital administration. Military working dogs were rarely allowed to stay in long-term civilian medical care, but separating them had proven catastrophic. During the one attempt to quarantine Brutus, Liam's heart rate had spiked to lethal levels, and he had gone into a violent, uncontrolled seizure. The dog, meanwhile, had nearly torn through a reinforced steel kennel door. Reluctantly, the board had granted a special dispensation. Brutus stayed. But the dog trusted absolutely no one. He barred his teeth at orderly staff, low-growled at doctors who moved too quickly with stethoscopes, and stood as a literal barrier between his broken handler and the rest of the world. Abigail Collins walked into this tense, heartbreaking dynamic on her third day as a psychiatric trauma nurse at Oak Ridge. She was 28, with quiet, observant eyes and a demeanor forged by her own profound private losses. Abigail had requested this specific ward. While other nurses gravitated toward patients who showed progress, patients who smiled and thanked them for their care, Abigail was drawn to the unreachable ones. Don't take it personally when the dog snaps at you, and don't expect the corporal to so much as blink, Nurse Brenda Wallace warned, handing Abigail the heavily redacted manila folder outside Liam's room. Brenda was a veteran nurse, exhausted and burned out by the endless revolving door of broken young men. He's a ghost, Abby. The dog does all the talking for him, and the dog only says, "Go away." Abigail took the chart, her fingers tracing the blacked-out lines of military sensors. She didn't see a lost cause. She saw a man desperately trying to hold the pieces of his shattered soul together. Taking a slow, steadying breath, she pushed open the heavy wooden door. Instantly, a low, rumbling growl vibrated through the room. Brutus was on his feet, the fur along his spine standing up in a sharp ridge. The dog's amber eyes locked onto Abigail, tracking her every microscopic movement. Liam didn't turn his head. He remained frozen, staring at the dead branches outside. Instead of advancing toward the bed, Abigail stopped just inside the doorway. She didn't speak in the high-pitched, patronizing tone that civilians often used with animals or the injured. She didn't offer a fake, cheerful greeting. She simply sat down on the small visitor's chair by the door, placed the chart on her lap, and looked at the floor. She made herself small, non-threatening, and still. "I'm Abigail," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, directing the words to the floorboards rather than the man. "I'm going to be sitting here for 20 minutes. I'm not going to touch you, Liam, and I'm not going to touch your dog. I'm just going to exist in your space." For the next 20 minutes, the room was suffocatingly silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock and Brutus's heavy panting. Abigail kept her word. When her timer vibrated softly in her pocket, she stood up, nodded respectfully to the dog, and walked out. She repeated this exact routine every single day for 3 weeks. During her off hours, Abigail pored over Liam's file. The military had blacked out the names of his unit members and the exact coordinates of his final mission, but they couldn't hide the medical timeline, a massive ambush. A medevac chopper taking heavy fire. 4 men in his squad killed in action. Liam and Brutus had survived only because they had been buried under the rubble of a collapsed compound, waiting 36 hours for extraction. But there was something else in the file that caught Abigail's eye. A faded, photocopied transfer request sheet from 3 years prior. It listed Liam's temporary attachment to a quick reaction force based out of Camp Bastion. Abigail's breath hitched in her throat. She recognized the unit designation. It was the exact same medical evacuation unit her older brother, Staff Sergeant Thomas Collins, had served in before he was killed by a sniper 2 years ago. Thomas had been a combat medic. He had written letters home describing the men he treated, referring to them only by their radio call signs to violate no operational security. One particular letter, tucked safely inside Abigail's jewelry box at home, spoke of an unbreakable young corporal and his Malinois who had provided covering fire while Thomas dragged a wounded Marine to the bird. Thomas had written, "If it wasn't for him and his dog, I wouldn't be coming home for Christmas. The guy is made of steel. We call him exactly what he is on the radio." Abigail stared at the blacked-out names in the file, a wild, impossible theory forming in her mind. Could Corporal Liam Hayes be the man who had saved her brother's life? Weeks bled into a stormy October, and the atmosphere in room 412 subtly began to shift. The first breakthrough wasn't with Liam, but with Brutus. By the 4th week of Abigail's quiet, demanding routine, the low growls had ceased. When she entered the room, Brutus would remain lying down, his amber eyes watching her with calculated intelligence rather than raw hostility. One Tuesday evening, Abigail entered with a small, unbranded leather bite tug. She didn't offer it directly. She simply placed it on the floor halfway between her chair and Liam's bed, then sat down. 10 minutes passed in heavy silence. Finally, Brutus stood up. He approached the leather toy with cautious, silent steps, sniffed it thoroughly, picked it up in his powerful jaws, and returned to Liam's side. The dog dropped the toy at the wheel of the chair and looked directly at Abigail, offering a single, soft boof. Liam's fingers twitched. It was the first physical reaction Abigail had ever seen him display that wasn't an involuntary reflex. He slowly turned his head, just an inch, his hollow, haunted eyes catching the edge of Abigail's uniform. Trust was a fragile bridge being built over an abyss, but a severe weather front in late October threatened to burn it all down. A massive thunderstorm rolled over the New York Valley just after midnight. Abigail was working the graveyard shift, organizing medications at the central desk, when the first crack of thunder violently shook the hospital windows. It wasn't a normal rumble. It was a sharp, concussive crack that sounded horrifyingly similar to artillery fire. Instantly, the emergency call light above room 412 flashed bright red. Abigail dropped her clipboard and sprinted down the hallway. When she pushed open the door, a scene of absolute chaos greeted her. Liam was out of his wheelchair, thrashing violently on the floor in the corner of the room. He was trapped in a terrifying flashback, his hands clawing desperately at the linoleum as if trying to dig through solid rock. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror, entirely disconnected from reality. Brutus was in a state of high distress, whining loudly, pacing around his handler, gently nudging Liam's shoulder with his nose, trying to ground him. But Liam was too far gone. Dr. Richard Stanton, the night shift resident, rushed into the room right behind Abigail, holding a syringe of heavy sedative. "Get the dog out of the way!" Stanton yelled, his voice laced with panic. "He's going to hurt himself. We need to sedate him immediately." "No!" Abigail shouted, physically blocking the doctor. "If you stick a needle in him while he's having an active combat flashback, he will fight you to the death, and Brutus will tear your throat out." "Nurse Collins, stand down. That is a direct order," Dr. Stanton barked. "Give me 2 minutes," Abigail pleaded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Brutus, who was now baring his teeth at the doctor, ready to defend his master from the needle. "Just 2 minutes, doctor. Please." Reluctantly, Stanton stepped back, syringe raised. Abigail dropped to her knees. She ignored the cold floor and the booming thunder outside. She crawled slowly across the room, keeping herself below Liam's eye level. She didn't reach out to touch him. She knew that any physical contact from a stranger right now would be interpreted as an enemy attack. "Liam," she said softly, her voice steady and clear beneath the sounds of the storm. Liam didn't hear her. He was gasping for air, his hands clutching the collar of his hospital gown, trying to rip it off. He was drowning in a memory of dust, blood, and screaming metal. Abigail thought about her brother's letter. She thought about the fierce loyalty of the dog and the unbreakable bond forged in the worst hell on earth. She had to anchor Liam to a positive memory of his strength, not his trauma. She had to use the one phrase that commanded respect, order, and survival. She crawled closer, ignoring Brutus's warning whine. She leaned in, placing her face just inches from Liam's trembling ear, and whispered the call sign her brother had written in his final letter. Iron 6. The words cut through the room like a physical shockwave. Liam's entire body went completely rigid. The frantic clawing stopped. The hyperventilation stalled in his throat. Even Brutus froze, his ears swiveling forward sharply. Abigail held her breath, silently praying to a brother she could no longer see. Iron 6, she whispered again, firmer this time, injecting a tone of absolute military authority. The medevac is clear. Your team is secure. Stand down, soldier. The mission is over. A blinding flash of lightning illuminated the room. In that stark, white light, Liam Hayes turned his head and looked directly into Abigail's eyes. For the first time in 8 months, the fog of the 1,000-yard stare vanished. There was clarity. There was agonizing, heartbreaking presence in his gaze. He looked at Abigail, then down at Brutus, who immediately whimpered and pressed his wet nose against Liam's cheek. Liam's trembling hand reached up, burying his fingers deep into the dog's fur. Tears, hot and silent, finally broke free, tracing tracks down Liam's scarred face. He swallowed hard, his throat working against 8 months of silence, fighting muscles that had forgotten how to function. He opened his mouth. Liam's voice was a harsh, agonizing rasp, like sandpaper grinding over broken glass. He stopped, coughing weakly, but his eyes never left Abigail's. He tried again, his grip tightening on his dog. My boys? Are they? Abigail felt a hot tear slip down her own cheek. They're safe, Corporal, she whispered back. You brought them home. Morning light broke through the heavy rain clouds, washing room 412 in a pale golden glow that felt entirely foreign to the previously bleak space. After Liam's raspy, tear-soaked question shattered 8 months of agonizing silence, the atmosphere in the psychiatric ward underwent a seismic shift. Dr. Richard Stanton had stood frozen in the doorway, the syringe of sedative dangling uselessly from his hand, utterly, completely bewildered by what he had just witnessed. He had wanted to file a formal insubordination report against Abigail for deliberately interfering with a medical intervention. However, Dr. Jonathan Caldwell, the chief of psychiatric rehabilitation at Oak Ridge and a retired Army colonel himself, intercepted the report the very next morning. After reviewing the security footage of the breakthrough, Dr. Caldwell not only dismissed Stanton's complaint, but restricted Stanton from entering Liam's room without Abigail present. Recovery, however, was not a cinematic montage of immediate triumphs. It was a grueling, agonizingly slow battle fought inch by inch. Liam's vocal cords had significantly atrophied from months of total disuse. Speaking felt like swallowing crushed glass. For the first few days following the thunderstorm, he could only manage a few hoarse syllables at a time before a severe, hacking cough would force him to stop. Abigail became his constant shadow, abandoning her rotation at the central nursing station to act as his dedicated one-on-one care provider. She brought him warm water infused with honey and lemon, anticipating his coughing fits before they even began. Brutus, sensing the monumental shift in his handler, completely altered his behavior toward Abigail. The Belgian Malinois no longer viewed her as a potential threat. Instead, when she sat in the small visitor's chair, Brutus would pad softly over to her, resting his heavy, scarred chin on her knee, offering a deep sigh of gratitude. The psychological walls took much longer to dismantle than the physical ones. Liam spent hours staring at his hands, struggling to reconcile the reality of the hospital room with the endless loop of the Arghandab River Valley ambush playing in his mind. He was crippled by intense survivor's guilt. During their quiet afternoons together, Liam began to force the memories out, word by painful word. He described the suffocating heat of the Afghan summer, the sharp, copper smell of blood, and the terrifying realization that his squad was entirely pinned down by an overwhelming enemy force. He spoke of how Brutus had dragged a severely wounded private behind a crumbled mud brick wall, taking a piece of shrapnel to the ear in the process. He recounted the 36 hours buried under the rubble, listening to the fading breaths of his men, completely powerless to save them. Abigail listened with unwavering patience. She didn't offer hollow platitudes, like it wasn't your fault or you did everything you could. She knew from her own grief that those words felt like insults to a grieving heart. Instead, she offered absolute, grounding presence. She validated his anger, his sorrow, and his profound sense of loss. By the third week of November, Liam's voice had regained much of its natural, deep baritone. The hollow, haunted look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a spark of resilient awareness. He was finally eating solid food. His reliance on the wheelchair was diminishing, and he had even begun walking Brutus down the hospital corridors, much to the amazement of the nursing staff. It was during one of these evening walks, as they sat on a bench in the hospital's enclosed courtyard garden, that Liam finally asked the question that had been haunting him since the night of the thunderstorm. The air was crisp and biting, smelling of fallen leaves and approaching winter. Brutus was busy sniffing a patch of frost-covered ivy near the fence. "Abigail," Liam started, his voice steady but laced with a heavy, unresolved tension. He turned to look at her, his jaw tightening. "My file is heavily classified. My call sign wasn't in any of the medical reports transferred to this facility. The Department of Defense redacted all operational details before I was even loaded onto the medevac at Ramstein Air Base." He paused, his piercing eyes searching her face. "How did you know to call me Iron 6? Abigail felt a familiar lump form in her throat. She had known this conversation was coming, but she had wanted to wait until Liam was psychologically stable enough to handle the emotional weight of her answer. She reached into the pocket of her thick wool cardigan and pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper. It was the letter, carefully preserved inside a clear plastic sleeve. "I didn't read it in your file, Liam," Abigail said softly, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the letter out to him. "I read it in a letter sent home 3 years ago, from a combat medic stationed at Camp Bastion. He was attached to a quick reaction force, and he wrote to me about a corporal and a Malinois who provided covering fire, so he could pull a bleeding Marine onto a Black Hawk." Liam stared at the folded paper, a profound sense of recognition washing over his features. He didn't take the letter immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted from the paper to Abigail's eyes, searching for a ghost he hadn't thought about in years. "Staff Sergeant Thomas Collins," Abigail whispered, a single tear slipping down her cold cheek. "He was my older brother. He was killed by sniper fire 2 years ago in Helmand Province. But before he died, he told me about Iron 6. He told me that if it wasn't for you, he wouldn't have made it home for our last Christmas together." Liam's breath hitched violently. He reached out with a shaking hand and took the letter. He didn't open it. He just held it, his thumb tracing the crease in the paper. The silence that stretched between them was no longer empty or broken. It was heavy with the profound, unseen threads of fate that had tied their tragedies together. Liam closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the hardened soldier had vanished, leaving behind a man overwhelmed by a miraculous, heartbreaking truth. Tension crackled in the cold November air as Liam stared at the folded letter in his trembling hands. The revelation that the young nurse who had pulled him from the abyss was the younger sister of Staff Sergeant Thomas Collins hit him with the force of a physical blow. He slowly lowered his head, pressing his forehead against his knuckles, as a ragged, tearless sob tore from his chest. Brutus immediately abandoned his investigation of the ivy, trotting over to press his warm flank against Liam's leg, whining softly in distress. "Thomas," Liam whispered, the name tasting like ash and old grief on his tongue. He looked up at Abigail, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You look just like him. The eyes. The quiet way you sit when you're observing a room. I should have seen it. God, I should have known." Abigail reached out, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on his shoulder. "He admired you, Liam. He wrote that you were made of steel." Liam let out a bitter, hollow laugh, shaking his head. "I'm not made of steel, Abigail. And your brother didn't just write a letter about me. There's something you don't know. Something the military didn't tell you about the day Thomas died." Abigail's heart stopped. The official casualty report had been brief and sanitized, killed in action by enemy sniper fire during a routine village patrol. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. Liam carefully handed the letter back to her, then reached down to unclip a small, hidden pouch from Brutus's tactical collar. His fingers, scarred and calloused, worked the zipper open. He pulled out a heavy, tarnished silver challenge coin bearing the insignia of the Army Medical Department. It was deeply scratched on one side, carrying a dark, permanent stain that no amount of scrubbing could remove. 3 years ago, When Thomas and I were attached to that QRF, we made a pact, Liam began, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He patched up a gunshot wound on my shoulder that should have sent me home. He hid the severity of it from command so I could stay with my squad. In exchange, I gave him my word that I would always watch his six. For a year, we were inseparable. He was the best medic I ever saw in the field. Liam swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the coin. 2 years ago, in Helmand, my squad was supposed to be running Overwatch for his patrol, but command redirected us at the last minute to secure a secondary supply route. We were 5 miles away when the radio call came in. Pinned down. Sniper fire. Tears finally spilled over Liam's eyelids, tracking down the deep lines of his face. I begged command to let us divert. I screamed over the radio, demanding they let me take Brutus and hunt the sniper down. But they ordered us to hold our position. We sat there, listening to the chaos on the comms, listening as they called for a medevac for your brother. By the time they finally let us move, it was too late. When I got to the compound, Thomas was gone. I found this challenge coin in the dirt where he fell. Abigail covered her mouth, stifling a sob. The pieces of the puzzle crashed together in her mind. Liam's profound mutism wasn't just a reaction to his own squad's fatal ambush 8 months ago. It was a compounding, crushing collapse of survivor's guilt. He had been carrying the ghost of her brother for 2 years, believing he had fundamentally failed in his sworn duty to protect him. When my own squad got ambushed 8 months ago, Liam continued, his voice breaking, I tried to use the tourniquet techniques Thomas taught me. I tried to be the medic he was, but I couldn't stop the bleeding. I failed my men, Abigail, and I failed Thomas. That's why I stopped talking. I didn't deserve to have a voice when the men I was supposed to protect had theirs permanently silenced. Abigail didn't hesitate. She slid closer on the cold bench, wrapping her arms around the broken soldier, holding him as he finally shattered completely. Liam buried his face in her shoulder, weeping with the raw, unchecked agony of a man who had carried the weight of the world alone for far too long. Liam, listen to me, Abigail said fiercely, pulling back just enough to force him to look into her eyes. Thomas didn't blame you. He knew the realities of war better than anyone. Command made that call, not you. You did not fail him. You honored him by trying to save your men. You honored him by surviving. And he would be absolutely furious if he knew you were punishing yourself by locking away your life in a silent room. She took his hand, closing his fingers tightly around the blood-stained challenge coin. Keep it. It belongs to you. It's proof that you loved him as much as I did. That conversation in the courtyard was the true turning point. The infection of guilt had finally been lanced, allowing genuine healing to begin. Over the next 2 months, Liam's progress was nothing short of miraculous. He engaged fiercely in intense physical therapy, regaining his strength and mobility. He became a mentor to other struggling veterans on the ward, using his own journey to pull them back from the brink. Brutus, sensing his master's total resurrection, returned to being a vibrant, playful Malinois, fiercely protective but no longer aggressive. On a crisp morning in late January, the heavy wooden doors of the Oak Ridge Veterans Rehabilitation Center opened wide. Corporal Liam Hayes walked out, his posture impeccably straight, no longer needing a wheelchair or a cane. Brutus walked proudly at his left side, wearing a bright red service dog vest. Standing by the exit, holding a signed stack of discharge papers, was Abigail. She wore a bright, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Liam stopped in front of her. He reached out, gently taking her hand, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her knuckles. Thank you, he said, his voice deep, resonant, and entirely his own, for giving me my life back, for giving Thomas peace. Go live a beautiful life, Iron Six, Abigail whispered, squeezing his hand. It's an order. Liam smiled, a real, breathtaking smile that reached his eyes. He turned, walking down the paved path toward the waiting transport van, stepping out of the shadows of the past and into the bright, unforgiving, yet beautiful light of a brand new day. Thank you so much for reading this incredible journey of healing, loyalty, and undeniable fate. If Liam and Brutus's powerful story touched your heart, please hit that like button to show your support for our brave veterans and their fierce four-legged companions. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping, real-life dramatic stories of survival and hope. Your support helps us tell more stories that truly matter.
Hi, my name is Tran Tan, the owner and manager of Noble Tales. After watching the video, he came home silent with his military dog until a new nurse whispered his call sign. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the quiet sense of hope. Sometimes a single moment of understanding can begin to break through walls that seem impossible to reach. It reminded me that patience and compassion often speak louder than words. Which scene stayed with you the longest? Do you think one small act of kindness can change someone's day, or even their life? Maybe this story encourages us to slow down, listen more carefully, and meet others with empathy instead of assumptions. If it meant something to you, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments, and feel free to like or subscribe if you'd enjoy more stories like this.